Well, it's good to have all of you to be with us this morning. And yes, my finger is about 20 degrees straighter. And I don't know what the big deal is about straight fingers anyway. I've kind of learned to use these crooked fingers, and it's really good. You ought to try it. And I love optimism. If you'll notice Rob's vehicle out here in the parking lot, he pulls in with a boat strapped on top. And I think he thinks we're in for big rains. You know, though the Weather Channel says the next 15 days is going to be over 100 degrees, he's ready for the floods. So we're really glad that you're here this morning. Last November 14th, 2021, we began our study in the book of Romans. And now we're coming near to the end of the study of the book of Romans. I think this Sunday and one more, and if I did my calculations right, that means we spent about 9 months on Sunday mornings in the book of Romans. Now, I've been through the book of Romans in a class setting before, maybe a couple of times. I have never been through the book of Romans in 20-minute sound bites on Sunday mornings. And yet for me, this time through in these little segments has probably been more productive and better for me than any other previous time. And what I hope is that for you who have been in this building week after week, and for those who watch us every week live, and for those who listen at other times during the week, I hope you have found benefit in this book of Romans. So we're going to be looking at two more lessons, two, I think, very important lessons. But I want you to think back for a moment about the book of Romans. The book of Romans began with this statement that the gospel of Jesus Christ, the story of the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, is the power of God for salvation. It's God's power whereby all people can be saved. And it doesn't make any difference your country of origin. It doesn't make any difference the color of your skin. It doesn't make any difference the economic background you're from. None of that makes any difference. This story of Jesus is the power of God for salvation for everyone. And Paul really wanted us to know in the book of Romans that we need this salvation. And so he really stresses this issue of sin. I guess it was a problem back then and still a problem today that so many of us don't even recognize we have a sin problem. We don't see it as a giant issue any longer. So back then in Romans chapter 1, he said, here's the way it is. The wrath of God is being poured out against all the sinlessness in this world. And he says there's idolatry and there's greed and there's sexual immorality, sexual sins. And there is envy, and there is deceit, and there is murder, and there is slander, and there's gossip, and there's excessive anger, and there's disobedience to parents. And he has this long list, and he says in chapter 2 of the book of Romans, if you don't think you're in that list, which some of us apparently don't think we're in the list, and yet you're out here doing the same things, you really are there. And so chapter 3 gives us a great big message. Every single person has no righteousness of themselves. We are all sinners. And then he makes this great big announcement. Do you remember the great big announcement? That we can have the righteousness of God poured out upon us by God's grace through Jesus Christ and by way of our faith. God will cover us with his righteousness. But then as he marches through the book of Romans, he says that here's something that happens to so many people. They kind of begin to take all this for granted. Does that surprise anybody? Don't we all tend to take special, wonderful parts of our lives for granted? And he says, here's how it looks when Christians begin to take this life of grace for granted. They begin to just keep on sinning, and they think, well, God will forgive me, and yeah, I sin, but forgive me, and you just keep doing that over and over again as though it's no big deal. And I fall into that trap, by the way, and maybe you fall into that trap. And Paul says, wait a minute. It's not supposed to be like that. And that's where in Romans chapter 6 he says, don't you remember how you got here? Don't you remember what really happened? That you were baptized into this new kingdom? And that's kind of looks like what Jesus did. Jesus was buried. And you rejected the person you used to be, and you were buried. And Jesus was raised by the power of God, and you were raised to be a different person. And then he keeps talking about that in chapter 12. He says that this different person is like not being conformed to this world any longer, but being a transformed person, being a living sacrifice person. And chapter 13, it was that hard material about being so different that I would respect authority, even when the authority over me is not good. I would respect it and submit to it in some kind of fashion. And then the last 3 weeks in chapter 14 about how we're all different in our spiritual maturity, and we have different opinions about different things, and we ought to accept each other without quarreling, and we ought to have peace and harmony in the body. And now we enter chapter 15. And he continues this same subject of being peace and harmony people. But then he begins to close these materials, and he mentions names, women's names and men's names of people who've been really important in the work that he's been doing in that congregation. But tucked in there in chapter 15 is one verse. One verse that I want you to look at this morning. And the interesting thing about this verse is, chapter 15 and verse 13, it's not new material. And I know what you're wondering. You're going to talk about one verse, and you spent all this time with introduction like this. How can we cover one more verse? Well, it's not new material. It won't take very long. But that doesn't mean it's not really, really important. Because it's going to talk about a subject that we've addressed a lot of times. I think, I'm not sure about this, I think I've been filling in here for 5 years. Filling in for that long. You may remember a long time ago, Susan and I walked in here just visiting, and the elders said, we're about to lose our preacher, would you fill in? And I said, no, I'm not interested. I gave them 3 reasons why I was not interested. And then they kept talking. I said, I'll try it for a couple of weeks. And I've been doing it ever since. Even while I would drive back on Sunday afternoons, and I would head back to Lubbock, and I would do that work with a healthcare company. And Susan would a lot of times stay here. And I'd come back in on Fridays. And in that early process, I stumbled onto a subject that has proven to be the one subject that's done more to change me than any other subject in a long, long time. And all the while I was looking at that, for months we looked at that one subject. For months. I never knew this verse was there. For months, I didn't know this verse existed like this. And so he says in Romans chapter 15 and verse 13, Burke has it on the screen, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So there are 3 words in that verse. Hope, joy, and peace. Without hope, where are we? Except discouraged, maybe despondent, maybe despair, those kind of words. And do you realize there are a lot of situations that in this world terminology that really are hopeless? There are some relationship issues that people face that really do seem to be hopeless. And sometimes people get in economic situations and the way out seems hopeless, and maybe is. And people approach the end of life, and sometimes that approach to the end of life is so abrupt, and we're so shocked by it. And sometimes the approach to the end of the life is slow, and it takes a long time. And the people in that approach realize there's really no future, and they don't have much hope with it. And sometimes this is the way life works. But may you be filled with hope, he says, no matter what the circumstances. And that word joy means, it just means happiness. It means to be really, really happy regardless of circumstances. Regardless of circumstances. And I'm telling you, there are all kinds of circumstances that stress me right now. The economy stresses me right now. Some of the situations in our country stress me right now. There are so many things that happen that I feel uncertain about. And joy seems a strange thing. And that word peace, it's not like the peace we've been talking about the last 3 weeks. The last 3 weeks been peace between us. This is peace in your heart. This is kind of living free of all this anxiety and this worry, and there's so much to worry about right now, isn't there? There's so much heaviness and so much concern. And yet, it's hope and joy and peace. This last Thursday afternoon, late in the afternoon, I talked to a young woman, don't know her age, probably in the late 20s, talked about her employment situation, whether or not she was going to stay working at this place or leave. And we've been trying to talk her into staying, but I realized that I could tell she probably didn't want to. And I said, you know what? You ought to do. You're so young. You're so talented. You ought to do in life what you think will bring you joy and peace. You ought to go that direction. And she thanked me for talking to her like that. Ironically, earlier in the day, somewhere around 10 o'clock that morning, I talked to another woman. This woman was about 42 years old, and she lives in Central Texas. And I talked to her only because a friend in Lubbock asked if I would be willing to talk to this particular person. She has a PhD in social work. And she is at the top of her field in the mental health research world. She is so very talented. As we would say it, she has a resume a mile long. She's a leading expert. And like so many of us, it's kind of miserable. And so I asked the question, what do you really want in life? What do you really want? What do you want more of? Now, I know the answer to that. It's hope, it's joy, it's peace. But can I tell you, I don't know if I'll ever have another conversation with her. But if I do, I hope somewhere along the way I can build enough relationship where I can say, there's not a job, there's not a place, there's not anything by the standards of this world, there's not a location, there's nothing that's going to bring joy and hope and peace into your life and give you what you really want. Except what Jesus Christ has to offer. It's what we have in the kingdom that brings hope into our lives, regardless of our circumstance. Do you understand that? There are going to be some circumstances face us that we can't ever change. And there are going to be difficulties that we're never going to be happy about. And there are going to be worries hanging around us all the time, and yet may God fill us, he says. May the God of hope, may the God that has something planned beyond this world, May the God who has something planned for you in this world and beyond this world, may the God of hope fill you with joy and peace as you, here it is, trust in Him. Trust in Him. See, that's the whole deal. That's the deal I've spent most of my life not understanding. That there are times in this life, and now I seem to find them all the time. Maybe it's my old principle, what you focus on grows. I find myself so often right now saying, I don't know how to handle this one. I don't know which way to go. I don't see any way out of this. Unless you do something, I don't know what's going to happen. It's not any different than what Daniel did before he's thrown into a den of lions. The old children's story. It's really not a children's story. It's a real life story. The old man of faith, who looks at God and says, there's only one way out of this deal. You're going to have to do something, or I'm going to get eaten by those lions. And that one, God chose to do something. Isn't that interesting? I've got to learn to live this life, not trusting in myself. That never works. I tried that one. Not trusting in money, that never works. So I talked this morning with a couple of people about what it would have been like to win that lottery last night or 2 days ago. $1.something billion. Poor guy's only going to get to take home, or lady, whichever one it is, $800 million. You know, what would I do with that? It's kind of fun to think about, actually. Money is never, ever, ever going to work. The world of hope and joy and peace. House is not going to do it. Another piece of land's not going to do it. None of it's going to work. It's the ability to put my confidence in God and say, you're in control. And I'll live like you're in control. And I'll smile like you're in control. And I'll quit all the worrying best I can because you're in control. And now there's an added benefit. There's an added benefit to this house. So that you may have hope in the power of the Holy Spirit. Did you catch that last part? The entire book of Romans it's been woven into that fabric of the book of Romans that you and I are the ones who possess God's Spirit. Because when we came out of that water and we walked into the kingdom, God's Spirit filled us up. And I'm not talking about becoming Superman or Superwoman. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about becoming Spider-Man or anything like that. I'm talking about living with a power that is ignited inside of each one of us when we trust in God with all our heart to live this abundant life, regardless of circumstances, that's hopeful, that's joyful, that's peaceful. Because I put my trust in Him, and He somehow that frees the Spirit to do what the Spirit wants to do in our lives. And apparently it's really powerful. I mean, late last night, the girls wanted to watch, what is that old show, Bewitched? I mean, it's a crazy show. I mean, she can blink or something like that and people appear, or people turn into a bird, or people turn into... That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that's real. Though I can't see it, I can't feel it, something that's real inside of us. And it's only ignited, it only really works when we put our trust and our confidence where it ought to be. Isn't that a good life? Isn't that the best life? And the entire book says it happens because this. Because God chose to save us by the gospel, by the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Isn't that interesting? You get all this because of Jesus. So we take a little moment every week. Every week we take a little moment and we try to remember that. It seems like an appropriate time right now to remember that. We're going to take the Lord's Supper and remember that Jesus really did come from heaven. The creator of this world came from heaven and literally was nailed to a cross for us, that we might have His Spirit living inside of us. We might be a people of hope and joy and peace in a world that is not built for hope and joy and peace. Did you catch that last phrase? This world was never built to naturally produce in us hope and joy and peace. God knew the only way we'd find it is through Him.